On the afternoon of April 16, 1985, a 43-year-old CIA officer named Aldrich Ames walked through the front door of the Soviet Embassy on 16th Street in Washington, D.C., asked to speak with the resident KGB officer, and handed over a package that contained the identities of every CIA and FBI source he knew of operating inside the Soviet Union, along with enough supporting information to allow the KGB to identify and arrest those sources at whatever pace and in whatever sequence served Soviet intelligence's operational interests. He received $50,000 in cash for the package. He walked back out through the embassy's front door, got into his car, and drove home to his wife. He deposited the money in a bank account a few weeks later in increments designed to avoid the reporting requirements that apply to cash deposits above $10,000. He continued showing up to work at the CIA's Soviet and East European division. He continued attending meetings. He continued drawing his government salary. He continued, for 9 more years, meeting with KGB and then SVR officers to whom he passed additional intelligence, receiving in return a total of approximately $4.5 million, more money than any previous American trader had been paid for comparable work. At least 10 people were executed as a direct result of the package he delivered on that April afternoon in 1985, and the subsequent information he provided in the years that followed. The actual number of people killed because of Aldrich Ames is not precisely known, because the CIA's damage assessment, the comprehensive accounting of what was lost and what it cost, has never been fully declassified, partly for reasons of ongoing national security classification, and partly, the documentary record suggests, for reasons of institutional embarrassment so profound that full public disclosure has been, across more than 30 years, consistently judged to be more damaging to the CIA's reputation and operational capability than the partial disclosure that has been available since his arrest in February 1994. Ames was caught not because the CIA identified him through diligent counterintelligence work, but because the FBI, working with information that the CIA's own investigators had developed and then failed to act on with sufficient urgency, assembled the financial and operational evidence that his arrest required. By the time he was arrested, he had been under some form of counterintelligence scrutiny for the better part of 2 years, and the CIA's internal investigators had repeatedly identified him as a suspect and repeatedly failed to follow the leads with the speed and the thoroughness that the accumulated evidence demanded. He was arrested in February 1994, 9 years after the walk-in that started the catastrophe, in a case that revealed institutional failures of counterintelligence that were, when the Senate Intelligence Committee examined them in the months after his arrest, so systematic and so long-standing that the committee's report described the CIA's performance as a failure that was extraordinary, and the word extraordinary in a Senate intelligence report is a word that carries the weight of something the writers could not bring themselves to call what it actually was, which was unforgivable, which was a betrayal of the people who had trusted the agency to protect them, which was the most consequential intelligence failure since the atomic spies of the 1940s, and one that, unlike the atomic spy case, occurred entirely within an institution that knew it had a problem and chose, year after year, to manage the knowledge of the problem rather than to solve it. Aldrich Ames was born in 1941 in River Falls, Wisconsin, the son of a CIA officer named Carlton Ames, who served in Burma and who brought his family into the world of the agency in the way that CIA families of that generation were brought in, through the social and professional networks of the early Cold War intelligence community. Through the specific culture of Georgetown dinner parties and collegial relationships, and the shared sense of participating in something important that characterized the agency's first generation of officers. Rick Ames, as he was known, had grown up adjacent to the CIA and had joined it as a trainee in 1962, at 21 years old, as the agency was at the height of its Cold War operational ambitions and its institutional self-confidence. He had spent his career in the Soviet and East European Division, the part of the agency responsible for recruiting and managing human intelligence sources inside the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc, the most important and most sensitive work the CIA did during the Cold War period, the work that required the cultivation of relationships with Soviet officials over years or decades, the work that turned on the ability to identify a person who was willing to betray their country, to develop that willingness into a commitment, and then to manage the source through the operational challenges of clandestine communication, the constant threat of detection, and the psychological stress of living a double life. Ames was, by the assessment of the people who worked with him, a capable analyst with a genuine feel for the Soviet intelligence target, a man who understood how the KGB thought and how Soviet officials behaved in ways that made him useful in the roles he was assigned. He was also, by the same assessments, a man with significant personal problems that the agency's security system had documented and assessed, and then largely declined to treat as disqualifying. He drank heavily, to the point where his drinking was noted in his personnel files at multiple points in his career, including an incident in Mexico City, where he had become drunk at a social event and left classified documents in an unsecured location. He was poor at the administrative aspects of his work, late with reports, careless with paperwork, the kind of officer who produced frustration in supervisors who valued his analytical abilities, but could not get him to meet basic procedural requirements. His first marriage had ended in divorce. He had met his second wife, Rosario Casas Dupuy, a Colombian national who was working as a CIA asset in Mexico City, and had married her in 1985, in the same year that he walked into the Soviet embassy, and Rosario's expensive tastes and her expectation of a lifestyle that his CIA salary could not support were, in his later account of his motivations, the proximate reason he had decided to sell what he knew. This account is almost certainly partially true and partially self-serving, because the full truth of why a person does something this destructive is almost always more complicated than the explanation they provide afterward, shaped as it is by the need to make the thing comprehensible without making it unforgivable. And Ames's explanation emphasized financial pressure in ways that his subsequent behavior, the continuing sales, the continuing accumulation of money and property, the years during which the financial pressure had been resolved, but the espionage continued, suggests was incomplete. He needed the money. He also, the evidence suggests, needed something that the espionage gave him beyond the money, something to do with the sense that he was operating in a larger arena than his CIA career had placed him in, something to do with the specific satisfaction of a man whose career had been consistently underwhelming, engaging in something that was, by any measure, historically consequential. The package Ames delivered to the Soviet embassy on April 16, 1985, was not his first contact with Soviet intelligence. He had established a relationship with KGB officers in Washington in the period before the walk-in, contacts that he characterized to himself and to the KGB as a controlled relationship, meaning a relationship that the CIA was aware of, when in fact the CIA was not aware of it. He had used the cover of authorized contact with Soviet intelligence officers to develop the relationship that would eventually produce the walk-in, exploiting the ambiguity that always exists in counterintelligence work between the authorized contact that allows an officer to develop relationships with adversary intelligence personnel and the unauthorized relationship that constitutes actual espionage. By the time he walked into the embassy in April 1985, he had convinced the KGB that he was a genuine volunteer rather than a dangle, an actual betrayer rather than a CIA plant designed to feed false information, and the package he delivered in that first meeting was designed specifically to prove his bona fides beyond any doubt. The package contained approximately 10 identities of CIA and FBI sources inside the Soviet Union, along with supporting information, descriptions of the sources' access, the nature of the intelligence they provided, the methods by which they communicated with their American handlers, that the KGB could use to verify the information's accuracy against their own records before acting on it. The names Ames provided in that first meeting included people who had been risking their lives for years to provide the United States with intelligence about Soviet intentions, capabilities, and plans. They included people who had families, who had built relationships with CIA case officers who had promised them that the agency would protect them, that the security of their communications was absolute, that the risk they were taking was being managed with a professionalism and a care that made it as safe as anything of this nature could be. They were killed because Aldrich Ames needed $50,000 and because the CIA's security system had been built on the assumption that the people inside it were not the problem. The specific fate of the sources Ames betrayed is the part of the story that the institutional histories and the damage assessments and the congressional reports treat most briefly, because the institutional histories and the damage assessments and the congressional reports are written by and for people whose primary concern is institutional function and national security policy rather than the specific human cost of the failure they are documenting. And the specific human cost is where the story's moral weight actually lives. The men whose names Ames passed to the KGB in April 1985 and in subsequent meetings over the following months were, in most cases, arrested within a year of the walk-in, tried in secret proceedings, and executed. The KGB moved carefully enough, spacing the arrests across a period of months and providing cover stories for why each individual had attracted suspicion that were designed to prevent the pattern from being immediately visible to American counterintelligence, a precaution that was, as it turned out, largely unnecessary, because American counterintelligence's response to the loss of its sources was distinguished primarily by its slowness, its institutional reluctance to follow the evidence to its logical conclusion, and its persistent preference for explanations of the losses that did not require it to conclude that the problem was internal. Among the men whose identities Ames provided was Dmitry Polyakov, the GRU general who had also been betrayed by Robert Hanssen and who was arrested in 1986 and executed in 1988, a man who had provided American intelligence with information of extraordinary value across a career as a source that spanned nearly 2 decades, whose contribution to American understanding of Soviet military doctrine and intelligence operations has been described by CIA and FBI officers who managed his case as among the most significant in the history of American counterintelligence. He was shot in the basement of Lefortovo prison by a KGB executioner who had been provided his name partly by Ames and partly by Hanssen, the two most damaging American traitors of the Cold War era, both contributing independently to the death of the same man without knowing the other existed. Among the others was Sergei Motorin, the KGB officer in Washington who had been recruited as an American source and who was recalled to Moscow and shot in 1987. And Valery Martinov, another KGB Washington residency officer turned CIA and FBI source, recalled and shot in the same year. And Gennady Smetanin, a GRU officer in Lisbon, who had been providing the CIA with information about Soviet military intelligence operations and who was arrested and executed. And Leonid Polishuk, a KGB officer in Lagos, who had been recruited in part because of his financial difficulties and who was arrested in Moscow in 1985 and executed. And Adolf Tolkachev, a Soviet military research scientist who had been one of the CIA's most productive technical intelligence sources for years, providing detailed information about Soviet radar and avionics research that had allowed American military planners to develop countermeasures and to understand the capabilities and limitations of Soviet air defense systems. A man whose value to American intelligence was assessed in the billions of dollars and whose execution in 1986 ended a source relationship that could not be replaced. The list continues. The CIA has never publicly confirmed the complete list of sources lost because of Ames, because the complete list would require acknowledging the full scope of the penetration. And the full scope of the penetration is, in the agency's assessment, still too sensitive to acknowledge publicly in its entirety. What can be said is that the walk-in of April 1985 effectively destroyed the CIA's human intelligence capability inside the Soviet Union for a period of years at a moment in the Cold War, when that capability was central to American understanding of Soviet intentions, and that the people who had provided that capability paid for the CIA's failure to protect them with their lives. The CIA's internal investigation of the source losses, which began in 1986 when the pattern of arrests and executions had become too clear to ignore, is a case study in institutional self-examination that produces, on examination, a picture of an organization that knew something was catastrophically wrong, knew approximately what it was, knew approximately where to look, and failed, year after year, to look at the specific person who was causing the damage with the thoroughness that its own analysis demanded. The investigation was initially managed by a small team within the Counterintelligence Center, the unit responsible for identifying penetrations of CIA operations, and the team's early work correctly identified the scale of the problem. The simultaneous loss of virtually every significant CIA source inside the Soviet Union in a period of months was not a pattern that could be explained by coincidental operational failures, and correctly identified the range of possible explanations, which included a human penetration of the CIA's Soviet operations, a technical penetration of CIA communications, or some combination of both. The investigation explored both possibilities and found evidence pointing toward a human penetration, but the identification of that penetration as a CIA officer rather than a KGB technical operation was a conclusion the investigation resisted reaching firmly for years, partly because the alternative explanation, that the KGB had somehow broken the CIA's communication security, was in some institutional sense less damaging, because it implied a technical failure that could be corrected, rather than a human failure that implied the CIA could not trust its own people. The investigation that eventually narrowed its focus to a list of officers with the access and the opportunity to have provided the source identities to the KGB was conducted intermittently and without the urgency that the scale of the losses should have demanded, in part because the investigation itself was being managed within an institution that was simultaneously trying to continue its operations, and that found the possibility that the problem was internal to be an uncomfortable one to pursue with maximum urgency. By the late 1980s, the investigation had produced a list of suspects that included Ames, but his name on the list was not immediately followed by the aggressive investigation of his finances, his lifestyle, and his operational patterns that would have produced the evidence of his guilt significantly earlier than it was actually developed. The specific failure to investigate Ames's finances is the failure that subsequent reviews have identified as the most consequential single investigative gap in the case, because Ames's financial situation was, by the late 1980s, dramatically and visibly inconsistent with his CIA salary in ways that should have been, and in the end were, the primary evidence of his guilt. Ames had, by 1989, purchased a house in the Washington suburbs for $540,000 in cash. He had paid off his wife's family's debts in Colombia. He had a Jaguar automobile. He wore expensive clothes. He ate at expensive restaurants. He charged thousands of dollars per month on credit cards that were paid off in full each month from accounts that contained money that could not be explained by his CIA salary, his wife's income, or any inheritance or other legitimate source of funds. He was living, by any reasonable assessment, the financial life of a man whose household income was several times what the CIA was paying him, and he was doing this in a way that was visible to anyone who looked at the externalities of his life with attention. The CIA's security office conducted a routine financial review of Ames in the late 1980s as part of the periodic security reinvestigation that all clearance holders are subject to, and the review noted the financial anomalies without treating them as requiring urgent follow-up. The review asked Ames about the source of his income, and he told them that his wife had family money in Colombia and that he had received some financial assistance from relatives, explanations that were not verified against external evidence with anything approaching the rigor that the specific anomalies warranted. The security office filed the review, noted the anomalies, and moved on. This failure, the failure to pursue the financial evidence that was sitting in plain sight and that ultimately proved to be the key to the entire case, is the failure that the Senate Intelligence Committee's 1994 report on the Ames case identified as the most egregious single lapse in an investigation, characterized by egregious lapses, and it is a failure that reflects not merely the specific performance of the specific security officer who conducted the review, but the institutional culture of the CIA's security and counterintelligence functions in the late 1980s, a culture that had been built around the assumption that CIA officers were trustworthy, that financial anomalies in a security review were matters to be noted and explained rather than investigated aggressively, and that the security review process was a compliance exercise rather than a genuine counterintelligence tool. The CIA had the evidence. The evidence pointed at the person causing the damage. The institution looked at the evidence and chose not to follow it, and the people whose lives depended on that choice being made differently continued to be at risk while the choice was not being made. The polygraphy failure in the Ames case is a separate but related institutional failure that the post-arrest reviews addressed in terms that were, by the standards of official assessments, unusually direct. Ames was polygraphed as part of his periodic security reinvestigation in 1991, a polygraph examination that he passed despite the fact that he was, at the time of the examination, an active Soviet intelligence asset who had been passing classified information to the KGB and then the SVR for 6 years. The CIA's polygrapher who conducted the examination reported no significant deception indicators. This outcome has been attributed by post-arrest analysts to a combination of factors that include Ames's psychological preparation for the examination, the specific countermeasures that he either applied naturally or had been advised to apply by his handlers, and the inherent limitations of polygraph technology as a reliable detector of deception in a skilled, intelligent, and psychologically sophisticated subject. The broader point that the polygraph failure in the Ames case illustrates is one that the intelligence community has consistently resisted acknowledging fully, which is that the polygraph examination as conducted by American intelligence agencies is not a reliable detector of deception in the population of people most likely to be actual intelligence assets. People who have made a deliberate decision to betray, who have prepared psychologically for the challenges that decision entails, who are motivated and disciplined, and who have the intelligence and the training to understand how the polygraph works and to manage their physiological responses in ways that minimize the indicators the polygrapher is looking for. The polygraph is, in the intelligence community's security apparatus, primarily a deterrent and a psychological lever. It deters people who are afraid of it and produces admissions from people who believe it is reliable, rather than a genuine detection tool. Ames was not deterred and did not admit. He passed. The CIA filed the result as evidence that its security process was functioning as designed. The process continued to function as designed for 3 more years while Ames continued to pass intelligence to Russian handlers and continued to collect his $4.5 million. The specific counterintelligence failures that allowed Ames to operate from 1985 to 1994 are individually comprehensible and collectively astonishing, because the accumulation of them across 9 years produces a picture of an institution that was repeatedly given evidence of a catastrophic problem and repeatedly chose to process that evidence in ways that allowed the institution to continue functioning as if the problem were smaller than it was. The 1985 walk-in and the source losses it produced should have triggered an immediate, comprehensive, and urgent investigation of every officer with access to the compromised source information. It triggered a slow, partial, and intermittent investigation that took years to produce a suspect list and more years to investigate the suspects on that list. The financial anomalies in Ames's lifestyle should have triggered an immediate, aggressive financial investigation. They triggered a cursory security review that accepted explanations without verification. The polygraph examination should have been followed by an examination of the financial records that the security review had already noted as anomalous, creating a combined profile that would have been very difficult to explain away. The polygraph result was filed, and the financial anomalies were not revisited. The 1989 CIA-FBI task force that was established to investigate the source losses and that eventually developed the lead pointing to Ames should have pursued that lead with the speed and the resources that a potential penetration of this severity demanded. It pursued it with the speed and the resources of an institution that was trying to manage a counterintelligence investigation while simultaneously maintaining the fiction that its operations could continue normally, which they could not, which everyone involved knew they could not, and which the institution nevertheless maintained, because the alternative, acknowledging the full scope of the penetration and the full extent of the operational damage, was an acknowledgement that the institution was not prepared to make while it was still trying to operate. The FBI's involvement in the investigation, which began in earnest in 1991 when the CIA finally shared enough information with the Bureau to allow a meaningful joint investigation, was the element that eventually produced the evidence for the arrest, because the FBI's approach to financial investigation was more aggressive and more thorough than the CIA's counterintelligence investigators had been in their examination of Ames's finances, and because the FBI did not have the same institutional investment in the CIA's reputation that had shaped the CIA's own investigators' approach to the evidence they had developed. The FBI did what the CIA should have done years earlier. It obtained Ames's bank records and his credit card statements and his tax returns and his property records, and it laid them against his salary history, and it found, in the gap between what he earned and what he spent, a discrepancy that amounted to approximately $4.5 million, and it concluded, correctly, that the discrepancy was not explained by his wife's family money or by any other legitimate source, and it built from that financial foundation the case that resulted in his arrest. The arrest of Aldrich and Rosario Ames on February 21, 1994, was not a simple operation. The FBI had been conducting surveillance of Ames for months before the arrest, building the evidentiary record that would be needed for prosecution, and the arrest itself was timed to prevent him from reaching his Russian handlers before the case was ready. He was arrested at his home in Arlington, Virginia, on a Monday morning as he was leaving for work. Rosario was arrested simultaneously. She subsequently pleaded guilty to conspiracy charges and received a sentence of 63 months. Her cooperation with prosecutors was the basis for a reduced sentence. Ames pleaded guilty to espionage and conspiracy charges and received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. He is currently serving that sentence at the Federal Correctional Institution in Terre Haute, Indiana, where he has given occasional interviews to journalists and has written some assessments of the CIA and American intelligence policy that have been noted for their candor about his own motivations and for their institutional criticisms that, whatever their source, are not obviously wrong in their substance. He has never expressed remorse for the deaths of the people he betrayed in terms that the families of those people have found credible or adequate, and the families of those people have, in the decades since his arrest, not been provided with anything approaching the full accounting of what happened to their relatives, that a government that understood its obligations to the people who serve it at the greatest risk would have provided. The CIA knows what happened to every source Ames betrayed. It has never told their families everything it knows. It has cited classification requirements as the reason, which is a reason that the families and the historians and the members of Congress who have tried to obtain the information have found inadequate given the decades that have passed and the operational significance of the specific sources that has long since been superseded by the passage of time and the end of the Cold War. The damage assessment that the CIA conducted after Ames's arrest, the comprehensive attempt to establish what had been lost and what it had cost, is, as noted, the document that the agency has most consistently declined to declassify in any form approaching completeness. What is known from the portions that have been released or described in official proceedings is that the losses were categorized as catastrophic by the assessors who conducted the review, that the human losses included at least 10 executions with the actual number assessed to be higher, that the loss of technical intelligence derived from human sources was so extensive that American understanding of Soviet military programs, weapon systems, and strategic plans was severely degraded for a period of years during what were, in retrospect, the final years of the Cold War, and that the operational recovery required to rebuild the CIA's human intelligence capability inside the Soviet Union and subsequently Russia after the Soviet collapse consumed years of effort and produced results that were, by the assessment of officers who lived through the reconstruction, never fully adequate to replace what was lost. The portion of the damage assessment that remains most sensitive is the portion dealing with what the CIA calls the second and third order effects of the Ames penetration, the ways in which the knowledge that the CIA's Soviet operations had been penetrated affected the agency's decisions about which assets to recruit, which operations to run, and which intelligence to trust in the years after the discovery of the losses, but before the identification of the source. During this period, the CIA was running operations inside the Soviet Union, while uncertain about the integrity of those operations, a situation that produced a kind of operational paralysis that intelligence professionals describe as particularly damaging, because an intelligence agency that does not know whether its operations are compromised cannot trust the intelligence those operations produce. An intelligence that cannot be trusted is not merely useless, but potentially actively dangerous, because it may have been shaped by the adversary to produce false impressions. The full extent of the intelligence that was degraded or rendered untrustworthy by the Ames penetration is the part of the story that the damage assessment was designed to establish and that the CIA has never been willing to fully disclose, and the most likely reason for this reluctance, across 30 years and multiple administrations and dozens of requests under the Freedom of Information Act and through congressional channels, is that the full disclosure would establish the extent of the institutional failure more clearly than the partial disclosure has done. And the partial disclosure has already been described by a Senate Oversight Committee as extraordinary. The systemic changes the Ames case forced on the CIA's counterintelligence function were substantial in some respects and incomplete in others. And the pattern of substantial change in some areas and incomplete change in others is itself revealing about the specific institutional resistances that the case exposed and that proved more durable than the post-arrest reforms were able to overcome. The CIA substantially reformed its counterintelligence structure, creating a more robust and better resourced counterintelligence center with clearer authority to investigate CIA officers when the evidence warranted it, establishing procedures for the mandatory reporting of financial anomalies that previous security reviews had noted and then allowed to go uninvestigated, and implementing a more aggressive approach to the financial investigation of officers in sensitive positions as a routine counterintelligence measure, rather than an exceptional response to specific evidence. It established a more regular and more rigorous polygraph schedule for officers in the most sensitive positions, though the inherent limitations of polygraph technology meant that this reform addressed the deterrence function more effectively than the detection function. It reformed its procedures for sharing counterintelligence information with the FBI, reducing the institutional barriers between the two agencies that had contributed to the years of delay in the Ames investigation, though the cultural differences between the CIA and the FBI that had produced those barriers proved more durable than the procedural reforms were able to address in the years immediately following the case. What the CIA did not do, and has not done, in the 3 decades since Ames's arrest, is provide the full public accounting of the damage the case caused that would establish the scope of the institutional failure clearly enough to make the reforms feel commensurate with the failure rather than proportionate to the version of the failure that has been publicly acknowledged. The partial disclosure has served a particular function. It has allowed the CIA to acknowledge a serious failure while managing the narrative of that failure in ways that limit the reputational damage to levels the institution can absorb without fundamental structural change. The full disclosure would make the structural change feel more necessary, which is presumably part of the reason the full disclosure has not been made. Institutions are not good at providing the evidence for arguments against their own continuation in their current form, and the full Ames damage assessment, if it contains what the fragments suggest it contains, is exactly that kind of evidence. The comparison between the Ames case and the Hanssen case, which unfolded in parallel across much of the same period. Hanssen's most active espionage years overlapped extensively with Ames's, and both were betraying CIA and FBI sources to the Soviet Union and Russia at the same time in some cases the same sources, is a comparison that the Senate Intelligence Committee's 1994 Ames report, which predated the Hanssen arrest, could not fully make. But that subsequent analysis has found illuminating in ways that neither case provides individually. The two men shared certain characteristics. Both were senior intelligence officers. Both were motivated by a combination of financial need and psychological factors that went beyond the financial. Both maintained their espionage for extended periods, in part because the institutions they worked for were reluctant to direct serious counterintelligence suspicion at their own officers. But the differences between them are as instructive as the similarities. Ames's lifestyle was extravagant and visible in ways that Hanssen's was not. Hanssen was careful with money and careful about not displaying the fruits of his espionage in ways that would attract attention, while Ames was conspicuous. Ames's motivation was substantially financial, with the psychological components serving as enabling factors rather than primary drivers. Hanssen's motivation was more substantially about the psychological satisfaction of superiority, with the money serving as enabling rather than primary. Both were caught not through internal detection, but through information provided by sources external to the institutions that had failed to catch them. Ames by the EEE, FBI's more aggressive financial investigation, and the CIA-FBI cooperation that eventually produced the evidentiary foundation for his arrest. Hanssen by the Russian source who sold his file. Neither case can be described as a success of the counterintelligence system, because in neither case did the counterintelligence system operate as it was supposed to operate. In both cases, the failure of the system to operate as designed was covered, imperfectly and at great cost, by sources outside the system that the system had not anticipated and could not have planned for. The counterintelligence lesson that both cases teach is the same lesson, and it is a lesson that the intelligence community has learned in the specific technical and procedural sense without fully learning in the deeper cultural sense, that the assumption of insider trustworthiness, taken as a baseline rather than as a working hypothesis subject to revision, is an assumption that sophisticated adversaries will exploit, and that the cost of the exploitation is typically borne not by the institution that maintained the assumption too long, but by the people who trusted the institution to protect them, and whom the institution, because of the assumption it maintained too long, was unable to protect. The families of the men Ames betrayed have, over the 30 years since his arrest, received from the CYA varying degrees of acknowledgement, explanation, and support that have been, in the assessment of those families, consistently inadequate to what the agency owes them for what was done to their relatives in the agency's name. Some of the families of executed Soviet sources have been permitted to know that their relative was working for American intelligence and died because of a penetration of American intelligence. Some have been told the basic facts of how their relative was identified and arrested. Few have been told the full story, including the specific investigative failures that allowed the penetration to continue for years after the CIA had enough information to identify it, the specific security failures that left the financial evidence of Ames's guilt unexamined for years after it had been noted, the specific institutional choices that were made during the investigation that prioritized the appearance of the CIA's operational continuity over the urgency of identifying the person causing the damage. The families know that their relative was betrayed. They do not know the full extent to which the institution that recruited their relative and promised to protect them failed to honor that promise in the years between the first evidence of the penetration and the arrest of the person responsible for it. The CIA has cited classification requirements as the basis for not providing this information, and some of those citations are genuine. There are details of sources, methods, and ongoing operations that genuinely cannot be disclosed without causing additional damage. But the classification requirements have also served as a convenient basis for withholding information that is not genuinely sensitive in the current operational environment, but that is institutionally sensitive in the specific sense that its disclosure would establish the scope of the failure more completely than the CIA's leadership has been willing to accept. This is the specific institutional accountability failure that the Ames case has produced and that the passage of time has not resolved. Not the failure of the investigation or the failure of the security system or even the failure of the counterintelligence culture, all of which have been acknowledged in the post-arrest reviews and reformed in various degrees, but the failure to provide the people who paid the highest price for the institutional failures with the full explanation of those failures that they are owed and that the institution has, for 30 years, chosen not to provide. Aldrich Ames is still alive in federal prison. He is in his early 80s. He gives occasional interviews. He has opinions about the CIA and American intelligence policy that he expresses with the confidence of a man who considers himself to have understood something about the institution he betrayed that its current leadership does not understand. His wife Rosario served her 63-month sentence and was released. Their son Paul, who was a child when his father was arrested and who had spent his early years in a family whose apparent affluence was the product of his father's espionage, is an adult now who has had to construct a life in the shadow of a father whose name is synonymous with the most damaging intelligence betrayal in CIA history. The men Ames betrayed are buried in graves that their families were not always permitted to visit, in a country that treated them as traitors because an American intelligence officer had told their executioners who they were. The CIA has built memorials to its fallen officers, maintains a wall of stars in its Langley headquarters lobby, with a star for every officer who has died in service, keeps a book of honor with names where the names can be disclosed. The Soviet and Russian officers who were executed because of Ames are not on the wall at Langley. They are not in the Book of Honor. They are not, in any formal institutional sense, acknowledged as people whose deaths the CIA bears responsibility for, even though the CIA's failure to protect them is what caused their deaths. The stars on the wall are for CIA officers. The people who died because a CIA officer betrayed them are remembered elsewhere, if they are remembered at all, by families who were told something happened and not told what, or why, or who was responsible, and whether the responsible party had ever been held accountable for it. They have been held accountable after a fashion. Ames is in prison. He will die in prison. This is the accountability the system produced 9 years after the walk-in, after a decade of investigative failures that the system itself generated and the system itself failed to correct. It is the accountability that was available within the constraints of what the institution was willing to acknowledge and what the law could prove. Whether it is the accountability that the people whose deaths it was supposed to address would recognize as adequate is a question that no one who mattered in the institution's decision-making process has, in 30 years, shown a serious interest in answering.